Hello everyone, this is Philosophy 67, this is week 10, and we are doing chapters from Stavros Stavridis' book Towards the City of Thresholds, and also an article by Michel Foucault. Remember that this is part 3 of the class. Okay, we started last week. It is called Technology, Machinic Assemblage and Death. Right, the first part of the class was on sovereign power and dialectical subversions, and then we did also the second part, okay, in which we saw the question basically of the prison, the camp, capture, the flight, lines of flight, okay. And so last time we read an article, an essay by Heidegger, the question concerning technology. And today, again, the question of basically the main concept is the concept of threshold. This is the concept that I want to uh, point out. There are two concepts actually. One is this of a threshold, but also together with threshold, the idea of a border, the border, and then also the concept of a heterotopia. Heterotopia, we usually think of a utopia or dystopia. Heterotopia is a concept that we find in this book. Okay, this is the book that we are reading from, and also in the article by Foucault. Remember the discussion for this the discussion entry for this part of the class for this week is again on more generic on the question of threshold in the city, but also beyond the city, and so is the journal entry as well. The question of the threshold. Think about what that means at the level of daily life, even in your experience, the relationship, for example, between the self and the other, the limit, the border. But the threshold is also more than simply a border or a limit. It is also the passage into what right the paths into something. So, and this is also what links the idea of threshold to that of a heterotopia. Now, the word heterotopia, like utopia, is the place that doesn't exist, right? The meaning of the etymology of utopia is topos, place, from the Greek language, and the prefix "u" is no, place, right? So it's the negation of the place that doesn't exist. Heterotopia, hetero is other, so it is the alternate space, precisely the other space, okay? So this is what we are going to see. And I believe that this is really interesting. So then write your discussion and board and journal entry as well. I begin, perhaps I want to focus on a few points only, okay? So I begin with the article by Michel Foucault, which is at times translated as heterotopia. Here it's over other spaces or alternate spaces, other spaces, right? Utopias and heterotopia, right? And so you see on page 3 of your document that Foucault says, first of all, the utopias, these are arrangements which have no real space. And then a few lines below, again, I highlighted this for you. In contrast to the utopias, these places which are absolutely other with respect to all the arrangements that they reflect and of which they speak might be described as a heterotopia, the other space. And you have the example of the mirror. We will speak about the mirror also in the city towards the city threshold with Stavridis, and the glass, the mirror. So you see it's highlighted there, and then you had the description of what the mirror is. That Foucault is speaking about, and here at one point he says, right, starting from it, in fact, I find myself absent from the place where I am, in that I see myself in there, in the mirror, right? Hence, the mirror functions as a heterotopia, since it makes the place that I occupy wherever I look at myself in the glass is important, right? The mirror, the glass, both absolutely real and also absolutely unreal. Okay, so the screen also in general, because today we live in right the age of the screen, digital technology. The screen, I'm looking at myself right now in the screen as I am right recording this video. So it's the same idea. The screen as the other space, other place. But in any case, if you go to the book by Stavridis, right in the introduction already, and so on page 13, I want to call attention only to a few moments, okay? So you see that he says in the next to the last paragraph on page 13, this book's main argument is that in the creation and social use of thresholds, a potential spatiality space, right, over emancipation. There is this space over emancipation emerges. Social struggles and movements are exposed to the formative potentialities of thresholds, and they are fragments of a different life. Otherness. Then he goes on speaking about the idea of the other. Otherness is often experienced in the inhabiting of in between spaces and times. Okay, so this in between is precisely the space of the threshold. Okay, so pay attention to these pages. I mean, actually, I ask you to read chapters 1, 3, 5, and 6, but page 13 and from page 13 to page 15 in the introduction is important. Then page 16 to page 20. On page 14, you have the idea of boundaries. Right, where Stavridis says boundaries, borders, therefore are created also to be crossed, right? So that's a very interesting question about the border, if you think of it politically, but not only between, say, one nation and the other, but within the city itself. That's what the book is, especially about the threshold in the city, but also at the level of, say, interpersonal relations, and even within the self itself, right? There are moments of a passage from one dimension into the other, one mood even into the other, and so on and so forth. Okay, so but it is also another important concept is that of identity, identity and difference, the construction of a social identity. So you find this also on page 15, page 16. So let me read this from page 17, actually, right? I mean, the top of page 17. The threshold is not a defining border that keeps out a hostile otherness, like the enemy that we already studied with, remember, Hobbes, Smith, and so on, but a complicated social artifact that produces through differently defined acts of crossing different relations between sameness and otherness, right? Identity and difference. So it is an in-between, a mediation, a mediating zone. Okay, so that's what he speaks of in terms of the construction of transitory identities, right? Because even the identity that we believe we already have is one that is a constant process of making, and therefore there is a constant, right, passage of thresholds into something different, something new. Okay, again, if you have questions, ask on page 18. There is this important question of the human ability to become other, right, which is a very important ethical capacity as well, right, being able to become other. And so, but again, I can't we can't read everything together. So on page 31 and 32 there is the question of the exception, the exception is the rule that we already saw in when we did Agamben, and actually Stavridis reads, he goes over the work of by Agamben, by Foucault that we studied, by Benjamin that we haven't studied per se, but I made some references to Benjamin before, and then it is on page 20 that you find the word heterotopia. Heterotopic spaces mark thresholds in space and time where dominant order and control are questioned. And we spoke about the society of control as well already, okay? So then there is a section on the red zones, which are very important today with the pandemic. Actually, the situation of the pandemic, if you think of it, creates so many new barriers and crossing points and therefore thresholds, right, limits, and so on and so forth in the city, and also within, say, neighborhoods and so on and so forth, right? So it is this idea here that you find very interesting on page 31, the state of exception that becomes the rule. You can read that and think of again what we saw already in Agamben. The camp, you find this on page 34, right? We saw the camp in when we did Homo Sacer with Agamben. He says, Stavridis says, the camp is not a threshold state, right? So he criticizes Agamben here, but it is, he says, it is a space of a normalized exception. Now think about the meaning of the camp, whether it's again at the concentration camp, the refugee camp, and so on and so forth, okay? So in any case, that's basically the idea. And he goes into the question of bare life that we have also seen before. And on page 39, he goes back to the question of becoming other, right? Or rather page 40. On page 40, there is this encounter with otherness. You know, think about that. What does that mean? What is it? I'm reading, to be able to become other. Because even identity is in this constant process of making not only whatever we understand as individual identity, but also collective identity, right? Communities, nations, and so on and so forth, right? To be able to become other, to be able to be in someone else's place, which is also a very important ethical demand, right? To understand the other. I mean, that what usually also goes under the name of perhaps empathy, right? So it is here that I'm reading that the power of inhabiting thresholds in between space-time lies. To be able to experience a change in identity, to be able to rehearse, test, check, and visit otherness means potentially to acquire the power to negotiate with otherness. This is, I believe, very powerful. So read this and see what you think about this question of the border, the self, the other, the question of the threshold, and so on and so forth, identity. And then also the question of thresholds comes back importantly on page 59. 60 traces, the concept of trace and individuality, and again the in-between moments, elements, and then another concept that I want to call attention to, then again you do the reading, is that of aura, which comes on page 62, then 63, and the references to Walter Benjamin that we haven't read per se, but I made references to his work. You find AURA, aura, which is a very important concept, on page 59 and 60, and the idea, the figure of the flaneur, right, the person who goes from place to place without any precise goal, right? And which is very important in Benjamin on page 63, 64. And then the concept of glass. Again, we saw the mirror in Foucault, and the concept in the section called Estadio Threshold on page then 69. You have the idea of a glass. He says, glass indeed, I'm reading, exposes because it brings the interior very close to the exterior, right? So, I mean, think about the difference between also the mirror per se and the glass that lets you see also beyond, right? So the question of the interior and the exterior. And then he goes back toward the end of the book on page 112 to the question of heterotopia. I hope that this concept is clear. Let me know if you have questions. I don't know if you, I wonder if you had ever, even thought about this concept, this word. Okay, but on page 112, let me see if I find it. There is another important moment, right, where he says, again, I'm reading, heterotopian conditions emerge when heterogenesis intertwines with reproduction and so on. So he says it is not as places of otherness, but it is the passage, as passages towards otherness, that we have this hetero, other, right? Topos, topia, place, other place, okay? And it is, he speaks of moving places, places in which whatever is happening has departed from the previous order without a given destination. Again, the idea of the flaneur, the person who wanders and goes from place to place without any precise specific destination, but that is precisely the idea of the moving into new places, very often accidental places. That's the idea of the general idea of everything being ultimately being a series of thresholds. Okay, so I hope that this is clear, but again, let me know if you have questions. By the way, I mean, I used also Stavridis in addition to other books when I wrote my own book, which is coming out on this Sunday, November 15th, which is called Singularities at the Threshold, precisely, right? So the idea of a threshold is one that I have particularly studied and used in my own book. Okay, so in any case, let me know if you have questions and do your writing assignments, reading and writing assignments. See you next time. Thanks.